everyone. My name is Miss Amy, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of my planned Halloween DIY videos. So these videos are designed for adults, for the grown-ups, for the caretakers of our small patrons that we help at the library, to help you figure out ways that you can make Halloween special this year. So we may all know that Halloween is going to be different this year, with the pandemic going on. We may not be able to partake in the things that we would normally do for Halloween, like trick-or-treating or haunted houses, either because local regulations make it tough to do so, or personal situations with health of family members being a concern this year. So I'd like to put together a couple of videos for you about how you can look at your surroundings and make some things that you may already have in your house or things that are low cost into decorations. The very first thing we're going to do is some pumpkin carving. So pumpkin carving with those under the age of 5 can be very interesting. When a child is 5 years or above, they may have the skills to be able to at least draw the design onto the pumpkin for you to carve, and then you as the adult would carve. But when a child's under 5, they don't even have the ability to do that drawing. So how do you get your pumpkin to look like a jack-o'-lantern? So the first thing, of course, is picking out your pumpkin, how big you want it, how small you want it, how round you want it, and do you want a stem? I always like having a stem on my pumpkin because it makes it easier to lift up the top and be able to put the top back on so that you get that nice glow in the pumpkin from the candlelight. But of course, all of that choice is completely up to you. I have a small pumpkin right now because I'm carving by myself. But I will probably get a larger pumpkin for when I decorate with my nephews later. I learned a lot of these techniques when I decorated and carved my first jack-o'-lantern with my nephews last year. And at the time, they were 3 years old and 1.5. They are now 4 and 2.5. So it will be an interesting, fun time for all of us. Let me go over tools. You do not need to buy all the fancy sets of tools that they have at the store. I bought some of the basic ones just because I really like these smooth scoops for smoothing out the inside of the pumpkin. And I love these giant spoons for taking all the goop out. If you have a really, really big salad spoon, or you happen to have an industrial-sized serving spoon, something that you get in a catering set, that'll work just as well to get the seeds and the goop out. But I really do like those two tools specifically. But, they have sets out there that have 17 different tools in them, 3 types of knives, and whatever else. I find it's just as well that you use a steak knife. If you've got a really big pumpkin, for the initial cut, you might use a butcher's knife. But I find that to be overkill unless your pumpkin is about as big as the table. So, I've also set up a baking pan with some tin foil on it, and that's to catch all of the pumpkin goop. You could choose to save the insides of the pumpkin goop. Look up recipes on how to roast pumpkin seeds if that's something that you're into and that's something you like. But I find that if you put the pumpkin goop onto this tray, lined in aluminum foil or wax paper or something like that, it's easy to kind of make into a big packet and just throw away. I like putting it on a tray as well, because while you're carving, after you've taken the goop out or while you're taking the goop out, the little ones might enjoy playing with the pumpkin goop. And you want to keep it kind of self-contained. I also have my entire table covered in newspaper. I just use the advertisements that are sent weekly to my mailbox. And I have another small cookie sheet that I've put my pumpkin on, only because I don't want it to accidentally roll away today while I'm doing the video. If you have a bigger pumpkin, it may not be feasible to put it onto an additional pan. So we'll start with cutting the top off the pumpkin. One thing that you can do is, if your child is old enough to hold the marker pen, you can ask them to draw for you. But you could just ask them, do you want just a round hole at the top? Do you want lots of spikes? Do you want it to be kind of squared? Do you want angles? Or do you want your grown-up to choose? A lot of times I find that they want the grown-up to choose. I always trace out a line and ask them if it looks okay. But from there, you're going to do your cut for your pumpkin. So I'm actually going to make mine relatively circular, my little tiny pumpkin, because on my little tiny pumpkin, it's actually going to be easier to do a circular cut. I find it harder to do a circular cut on a bigger pumpkin. One thing you want to remember to do is angle your cut so that you're not going straight up and down in, because then your lid will fall into your pumpkin, especially if it sits around for any amount of time before Halloween. But if you cut at a diagonal into the pumpkin, so instead of going up and down like this, I'm going to go diagonally in, then you're going to wind up with a lip to hold the lid onto. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the pumpkin, and I'll join you when I'm ready to start scooping. Okay, so I've almost got all of my cut made. One good thing to remind you all of is that when you're cutting, you're not necessarily always going to be able to cut exactly along your marker line. Your cut might be slightly off from it. A couple of things about that. You can always tell the kids nobody's going to see it on Halloween night because it's going to be dark. But if they're really worried about it, a pencil eraser will take the marker off. Bet you didn't know that. So now I've got just the last couple of things to do to get that lid off. I'm going to kind of pry it up and see where it's still connected. And notice I'm taking care to cut away from my hand. We always want to use our knife safety. Okay? So I'm cutting away from my hands and making sure that I'm doing that. So there's my nice little stand. Okay? So that's going to be my lid. Now, I always like to clean up my lid a little bit so that it's not so pointy. It keeps the flames from burning and making a very weird smell go through the neighborhood and the house. So I just kind of smooth off the end so that it kind of will sit on whatever surface I put it on. It's going to be nice and flat. So I'm going to set that off to the side. Okay. And put those pumpkin pieces onto my pumpkin guts tray. Now this is the part where it gets messy. So you want to remember to take off any kind of jewelry, watches, whatever, and put them off to the side. Okay? Because you don't want them to get all goopy and icky and whatever else. So I've got my pumpkin, and it's got its guts on the inside. And now the hole I made is a little bit small because I did that diagonal cut. So I'm actually going to use my knife to scrape away a little around the inside so that I have a bigger hole to put my hands into. Okay. So now That's what the big scoop's for. That's for getting in there. And it has serrated edges on the side of the big scoop so that it can pull out all that webby pumpkin gut and scrape it away from the side. So, and again, I'm just putting it right down onto that tray that I lined with the aluminum foil so that the kids can play with it, or you can save all these glorious pumpkin seeds. I'm going to try to get a good scoop full of them out here for you to see. And then if you look up recipes online, there's all sorts of places where they tell you how to wash them up and get them ready to roast in your oven so you can have roasted pumpkin seeds. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to continue to scrape out the inside of my pumpkin, and I will be right back. Okay, so now I've got most of those guts and seeds removed from the inside of the pumpkin. I'm actually going to switch to my little pumpkin scoop, because this is the one that's going to smooth out the bottom so that you can put a candle or one of those electric tea lights in and not have it falling over. I also like to have a really smooth inside because I feel it helps when you cut the design on the outside, so that you don't have those pieces that you're trying to cut and then they're just stuck to the inside. So if you can get it as smooth as possible on the inside, okay, by just reaching in and really using some muscle to scrape around on the inside and just scrape that down. Okay, so I'm going to keep working away on my pumpkin. I hope that you guys are either working away or you'll be working away on one soon. I will be back as soon as I've got the insides nice and smooth and ready to cut. Okay, so now I have the insides of my pumpkin sufficiently cleaned out. There's no extra strings or anything in there of pumpkin guts. I'm going to clean off the surface of my pumpkin to make sure that there's no pumpkin guts on the outside here. And then I usually ask the child that I'm working with to choose which part of the pumpkin we're going to put our face on. Whether it might be this more flat side here that has more bumps, bruises, and nooks and crannies in it, or whether it's the relatively smooth but round side. So I'm going to choose to put him on the round side this time. And this is where things get a little harder to do when you've got children that are under 5. So as we discussed before, they can't necessarily draw their own shapes on. So how are you going to empower them to design their own pumpkin? I know a lot of people like to use the stencils and things, but what I really like to do is have a paper with all sorts of shapes drawn out, and I ask them to either name or point at the shape that they want for each feature. I have 2 nephews that I do this with, so I ask each one of them to choose a shape for an eye. So last year we wound up with a pumpkin with a triangle eye and a circle eye, and a square nose. But you can, ask them all sorts of questions, what shape do you want for the right eye? They can choose their shape and you draw it onto the pumpkin. And then what shape do you want for the left eye? They choose their shape, you draw it onto the pumpkin. You can ask them, do you want the little circle eyeballs inside the eyes? Because sometimes they might want those little half circles and sometimes they might not. So all of those details you can draw onto the face of the pumpkin before you start carving. I tend to use Sharpie markers. Again, you can erase the extra lines with a pencil eraser if that's a problem for your child, but it leaves a mark that you can easily see where you're going to cut. So I'm going to do kind of what I did last year with my nephews. I'm going to do a triangle for one eye, and they like having the circle eyes in there. And I'm going to do the square for the other eye. And again, with the half circle eyeball. Okay. So, and do you want a nose? That's always a question to ask. Do you want your pumpkin to have a nose? If they don't, they don't. If they do, they do. Doesn't matter to me, right? So we're going to leave my pumpkin without a nose this year. And this is where you can have fun. Okay. The mouth of the pumpkin. You have serious, serious questions to ask. First off, do you want your pumpkin to be scary? A lot of little ones might say no to that. There are a few that might say yes, but a lot of them might say no. So then you say, do you want your pumpkin to be smiling or do you want him to be frowning? Okay. And then you say, do you want lots of teeth or do you just want a big open smile? And depending on what they tell you is what you're going to draw on the pumpkin. I had my nephew tell me every place he wanted to put a tooth. So I would start drawing, and when he would say tooth, I would draw a tooth down. If you're putting teeth in, ask what shaped teeth they want. Do they want them to be square? Do they want them to be more pointy and triangular? Because the style of teeth influences how friendly or scary the pumpkin looks. Okay. So I'm going to make our pumpkin mouth. Okay. And I'm going to give him a couple of teeth. And one thing you also have to think about is don't draw it too close to the bottom of the pumpkin. So if you set this pumpkin down, you don't want the smile to be way down here because then the pumpkin's not going to sit right. So when I started this line, I thought I was going to make the top of the smile. But as I got down to the bottom, I realized this is going to be the bottom of the smile of my pumpkin. I'm also going to make him smirk, right? So he's only going to have a smile on half his face. So I'm going to stop his smile right about here. And then I'm going to do the top part of his smile. And again, a couple of teeth. And now he's a half smiling, smirking pumpkin. Okay. Once you get all of your shapes drawn on, this is the time that the grown-ups have to use to cut the pumpkin. Okay. So you want to make sure that you are being extremely safe with those knives, that you're showing your knife safety. And if your children are extremely rambunctious, it's when I encourage them to play with the pumpkin slime. And if they don't like playing with the pumpkin slime, you can always say, I will call you back when the pumpkin's finished. But my nephews, who are extremely rambunctious young men, were enthralled with watching me cut the pumpkin last year. They absolutely loved it. So I will be right back after I finish cutting our pumpkin face out so you guys can see our finished pumpkin. Okay, so I have one more eye to cut out. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys my technique for doing the eyes and even the mouth, the little tiny cuts. So that any knife that you have at your house might be too big to get some of those tiny cuts. So that is where the knife part or the saw part of those pumpkin carving kits does come in handy. But I've always found it hard to start the cut with the saw because it's a really flexible blade. And I've had a couple of them break on me over the years. They've gotten better, but they're still extremely flexible. So I tend to start my first cut in any shape with a bigger knife that I just kind of plunge through and work around. And then I'll take the saw, put it through that first cut, and saw through the area. And then once that first cut is made, you have a place to start all your other cuts, right? And it kind of punches through a little bit easier. And the nice part is you can get these nice little round areas done and any tight corners done pretty easily with this little saw. And then once you've got an area that you've cut all the way around the edges, I always find it easier to push the shape into the pumpkin. And then you just have to retrieve those pieces from inside of the pumpkin. Now I'm also using my little knife here to trim out areas that are maybe a little too thick on the inside so you can better see the shape of the pumpkin that you're carving, right? Okay, so now we've got our pumpkin and he's got a hat on, and I'm all ready to get a tea light to put in him for Halloween. And I think he looks spectacular. If for some reason your handle breaks off or your lid is a little too loose, or you're worried about it loosening up before Halloween, if you put some toothpicks in around the edges, it will help hold that lid up. But I hope you had fun learning how to carve a jack-o'-lantern with little ones. And I hope that you'll have a fun and happy Halloween.